Welcome to a walkthrough of the K-2 Skills Lesson Internaliazation. Kindergarten, first, and second grade teachers should complete this lesson internalization template prior to teaching a lesson. The lesson internalization template helps teachers determine what instructional strategies and learning activities will ensure students' success in meeting the primary focus objectives of the lesson and should be completed prior to delivering daily lessons. As you can see on the screen in front of you, we have the K-2 Skills Lesson Internaliazation. For today's purposes, I will be using Grade 1, Unit 1, Lesson 27 as an example. There are 3 separate sections within the lesson internalization template. The first section is where we are going to review the lesson. There are 3 steps within this section as we review the lesson. The first is to review the primary focus objectives and align standards. Then we're going to identify how the primary focus objectives build towards student success with the standards. For this portion, we're going to be using the introduction in our teacher guide. The second step will be to complete the formative assessments identified on the first page of the lesson, including the student activity book page, when applicable, where we'll record what foundational skills students will need to demonstrate on the page, or the student reader chapter, if applicable, where we're going to read the chapter and record what sound spelling correspondences students will need to master to be successful with the chapter. This will be on the last page of the student reader. As you'll see in today's example, you may not always have both pieces to utilize for a lesson, so it will depend on each particular lesson and those objectives. The third section is to complete the check for understanding and record what foundational skills students will need to demonstrate to be successful on that check for understanding. These are found directly in the lesson itself. So let's take a look. As you can see, this is Lesson 27 in Grade 1, Unit 1. Over here on the left-hand side is a page that will be at the beginning of every lesson. Here is where it highlights those primary focus objectives of the lesson, as well as points out the formative assessments that will be part of the lesson. I made a note here in my teacher guide. I like to highlight those primary focus objectives as I'm reading through the lesson and preparing for it. You may choose to use sticky notes to write notes on it. Annotate it however it works best for you and your planning purposes. I noticed that in this lesson, it's a review and it's tricky words. The primary focus of this lesson focuses on 2 different foundational skills. You'll see those tiques are notated after each primary focus objective, as well as after the formative assessment that we'll be using. The foundational skills in Lesson 27 include that students will orally blend and segment single-syllable words with up to 4 phonemes. And then students will read the following tricky words: where, what, which, who, when, and why. The formative assessment that's highlighted on this first page for every lesson, in this particular lesson, is oral blending and segmenting, and it's an observation. I note that in my teacher guide, there is an oral blending and segmenting observation record. And so what I made note is that I want to make sure that I pull this record out and I prep those students' names that I want to focus on in this particular lesson. I know that oral blending and segmenting is typically part of a warm-up portion of my skills lessons. And so, as you can see, this is an example that's also included in your teacher guide. And by lesson, as a teacher, I need to determine which students I want to be observing so I can take these notes on their progress towards mastering that blending and segmenting. So I wanted to make note as I'm preparing for this lesson and this lesson internalization that I'm going to make sure I include those students that I want to focus on in Lesson 27 during the warm-up for that blending and segmenting. Then I also am looking, as stated in that initial part of our lesson internalization template, I want to look at the check for understanding. This is directly within my lesson. So whereas the formative assessment is on the overview page of the lesson, these check for understandings I look through, and there's an icon that notates when there is a check for understanding. For lesson 27, it is to monitor students as they hold up their word cards, paying attention to whether or not they are choosing the correct tricky words. So in this lesson, my students are going to be creating word cards and they're going to hold that up. That's going to be a visual observation for me to see their understanding of that particular primary focus objective. And so I'm noticing that for this check for understanding, it's addressing the tricky words primary focus objective, where the oral blending and segmenting observation record is addressing the first foundational skill that's listed. I'm going to move on now to that second portion where we are going to be diving into the lesson itself. For this portion, we're going to be using the at a glance chart. This at a glance chart is at the beginning of every lesson. It's a great just overview of the lesson itself. So we're going to spend some time looking at that because we'll be able to access what materials we need. We'll also be able to see exactly what is the intended learning for each component within our lesson and so on. So let's focus on this fourth step where we're reviewing that lesson at a glance chart, looking at what the intended learning is of this component, how this component is going to set my students up for success with that check for understanding that we just notated was dealing with tricky words, and the formative assessment that is on oral blending and segmenting. And then what materials will I need for these components? Here's the lesson at a glance over here in the corner, and you'll notice that right away, each particular section within the lesson lists specifically what that component is addressing. So in that warm-up, that oral blending and segmenting, it's for phonological awareness. I'm building that phonological awareness. The tricky word section is for word recognition, and there's two different sections within the lesson that's addressing that. And then there is another foundational skill in this lesson where we're focusing on the conventions of standard English, and in this particular lesson, really reviewing what a question mark is doing in a sentence and how we read differently when we see a question mark at the end of a sentence. So again, that word recognition piece for the tricky word cards, that's directly related to that check for understanding I just highlighted. The warm-up section is the oral blending and segmenting, and again, there will be words listed for you to utilize during this warm-up section that is specifically addressing that phonological awareness piece. Again, you can see this lesson at a glance. We're going to look at other aspects of it, but not only does it give you each different component within the lesson, what that component is addressing, it gives you grouping suggestions as well. As we know with grouping, that's going to depend on specific needs for your students. These are all intended for a whole group. You may be pulling small groups to provide additional reinforcement, or you may, when you get to the customization piece, be changing up this grouping a bit as well once you're feeling more comfortable with the teaching of the lessons themselves. Gives you timing for each of the lesson components. And then we're going to move on to the next section where it's going to be highlighting the different materials that I'm going to be needing for this lesson. So as you can see for the warm-up, that oral blending and segmenting, there's no materials listed. I know at this point in the curriculum that my students are using their fingers as we're blending and segmenting together. But for the tricky word section, each of my students is going to need 3 yellow index cards because they're going to be writing those 3 tricky words on those cards as we're going through this component of the lesson. For the review the question mark portion, there are no specific materials that are needed. And then for that second part of the tricky words, they're just going to need pencils and some more index cards, and it gives me specifics of 6 per student. So in my teacher guide, I like to just, with a sticky note, jot down those materials so I have it, so I make sure every day that I'm ready with the materials for that particular lesson. As we continue to dive into the lesson, we're going to be looking at what student engagement strategies are included in each component of this lesson. Again, what materials, if there's additional things like maybe a chart paper that it suggests either writing things on a chart paper or on the board. I'm going to decide how I want to present that information to my class. And then finally, what considerations do I need to keep in mind to make sure that all students have access to and can interact with this grade level content in the lesson. So let's take a look at that portion. So here what I did is I went ahead and took screenshots just to walk through with you of the different pages within the lesson. So there's 3 pages on this screen, and then we'll go on to the next screen. And I wanted to show you how I annotated my lesson plan itself. Again, this is your teacher guide. So if you are highlighting things within your teacher guide, attaching sticky notes, if you like to type it up, however you want to address, it's to make sure that the lesson components are addressed for each lesson, that you're prepared to teach them, that you're seeing how they build on each other through the lesson, and that you're prepared with materials and all of that prior to teaching the lesson. So as you can see, I'm just going to walk you through some of my annotations. These sidebar supports are fantastic and really important to be reading through. It's providing you with ways that you can give additional support to students as you're working through the lesson, making sure that all students have access and are successful with this grade level material. So I just made a note here that this is important for visual support. I have students in my class that really benefit from that visual support. So as I am going through this section, I can provide pictures to demonstrate the words that are depictable. So for example, big or clean or rough, fat, those I want to make sure my students understand those words and provide a visual example as we are blending and segmenting. I also made note here, this is where it's talking about that oral blending and segmenting observation record. I made a note to myself, that I need to print that record off so that it's ready to go for the lesson. Typically, I will have already printed it off earlier within this unit because as you remember, I have added a few students each lesson that I am going to be taking those observation notes on. For the section where we're working with tricky words, we're doing the same sort of procedure for each word, what, which, and where throughout this. So when we get to a point where in the lesson it asks that students are repeating the word and then using it in a question, I may note that I want to make sure that that's turn and talk, that I'm remembering this is an important engagement piece, that I want to make sure that I'm providing students opportunities to turn and talk with their partners, where they're repeating that word and using that word in a sentence, and then I'm going to make sure I call on particular pairs to share out as a whole group. As we continue through, this is another side support that stood out to me, so I took some notes where it's for each of these tricky words that I'm introducing, it says to tell students that a question that begins with, for example, the word where is usually answered by naming a place. Also, that questions that begin with the word which is usually answered by choosing something. So it gives me these side supports throughout, and this I just notated, it's really helping with providing that context, and I want to make sure I'm giving that guidance as my students are preparing to turn and talk with their partner for each of these tricky words. Then I just made note for another student engagement for myself. I like to use popsicle sticks. When we're doing this tricky word practice where I'm asking students to say the word and use it in a sentence, I'm going to just choose popsicle sticks so that I have that random selection of students doing this portion with the whole group. This is just a continuation of the same lesson, the next 3 pages, and I'm going to walk you through what I notated on this for the diving into the lesson portion of the internalization. I made sure that I wrote that I need to have chart paper. I prefer to use chart paper so we can go back and look at that. evidence of our learning if as we continue on through the unit. So I wanted to make sure this is the portion where we're talking about question marks. And so when I'm writing the following questions and answers on the board or chart paper, I made sure that I wrote chart paper, and it's also telling me that the answers are in different colors. So I'm showing them this portion, where did Nat and Dot get Bud? I'm going to write that in one color, and then Nat and Dot got Bud from the vet. I'm going to write that in a separate color. So I just made note that I need multiple markers for that. For the tricky word card section, again, I made note I need to have blank index cards available. And then I also wrote that independently writing tricky words, some my students may need additional support, because I'm giving these blank index cards for students to write the tricky words that we have been practicing in this lesson. I'm going to make sure that I provide additional support for those students that I know are going to need it when we get to that part of the lesson. In that portion of the lesson, students are holding up the question card that they've written, the question word that they've written on their index card. So this is a great nonverbal student engagement where I can get a visual of how my students are working towards mastering this component. And then here is that check for understanding. So I just made note of it. This is, again, how I'm going to make sure that students are understanding this portion. In lesson 27, there are a couple of additional support activities I am going to use with those students who need additional practice with blending and segmenting. So I'm going to notate, I'm going to make sure that I'm meeting with these 3 students to do this additional support after we get done with the lesson. The final part of the lesson internalization is really working to customize the lesson. As it states on the template, it is recommended that you only move into these steps when you are ready and feel comfortable with the lesson plans as they are written and are ready to make some adjustments. That being said, once you do get to a place where you are ready to do some customization of your lessons, please note that you may only choose to do particular pieces of this customization section on your internalization document. Every step does not need to be addressed when you are customizing the lesson. So I'm just going to go over these steps within the customization and then show you an example of how I customize this particular lesson. So for example, if there is not a check for understanding included within the portion of the lesson, I'm going to pay attention to how am I going to make sure that I'm checking for my students' understanding and what am I looking for, what's acceptable for performance for that. So I might add an additional quick nonverbal thing where I can observe, or some other check for understanding so that I can make sure that particular component of the lesson has been addressed. Then also it's looking at grouping of students. So it could be from students who have already mastered that particular objective to students who need additional support. I already kind of made some notes about how I wanted to notate which kids I wanted to do those additional components, but you'll see I address this as well in a moment when we go back to the lesson. I'm going to look at what possible misconceptions might students have during the lesson. So as I get more and more comfortable teaching the lessons, I'll notice, and as you remember when we did the unit internalization, where are those tips and explanations in that introduction for those sort of tricky portions that you'll be teaching. So I will get to a point where I'm realizing, oh, I remember that in this lesson, students really struggled with this piece, so I want to make sure that I'm addressing that in the lesson today. Additional engagement strategies that I want to incorporate. So as you know, you see which particular strategies work best for your students, and that can change from year to year and even within the year. So I'm going to make sure I'm incorporating those strategies that I know have been successful with engaging my students. And then also, where in the room will you execute this lesson? Or if you're teaching remotely, how will you address this lesson? What sorts of strategies are you going to be using to really work with students who are working remotely as well? So let's take a look. Again, this is the same lesson. I included my original notations that I'd done, but I just added some in blue to show you how I customized. So when we got to that tricky word practice, instead of just having my students say the word and use it in a sentence, for those students who have already really mastered this, I want to give them dry erase boards so they can write their sentences down rather than just verbalize them. Then when we got to the portion where we're looking at the question marks and really focusing on that particular primary focus objective, I want students in this section where I'm asking them to listen to my voice as I'm saying the following questions, I am going to have them repeat the inflection when I model it. So I think that's a fun way to get students engaged, but then also for them to not just hear my voice, but then hear themselves and their classmates asking questions and really working on kind of that genuine. I know when I've taught this in the past, sometimes when you talk to students about having their voice go up at the end, that sometimes it gets a little artificial. So this is a really good opportunity for us to practice together and give guidance as we're going through that. Then on this, as we continued through that, this portion of the lesson with question marks, there's a portion where I am drawing question marks on a chartboard or paper and asking students, or pointing out when a period or a question mark is at the end of a sentence. So I'm going to read some. I added as a customization piece some sentences and ask them to show me one finger if a period would go at the end of that sentence and two fingers if a question mark would be at the end of that sentence. Just again to extend it and really keep my students engaged. And then I also just made a note over here that I want to do this portion where students are deciding which tricky word would go at the beginning of these sentences. They're using these tricky word cards, so I made note that I want to make sure this is done at their table so that they can easily manipulate those word cards as we're working through, and I can easily, this is a check for understanding piece, so I can easily see their progress with that. So as you can see, this lesson internalization template is a chance for you to really dive into the lesson itself, make notes on what's going to be important for you to remember as you are delivering the lesson. How you do that is completely up to you. If you annotate, highlight, do a combination of both, but whatever it takes to make sure that you have a solid understanding of the lesson prior to teaching it, where you have the materials necessary, and where you've really planned out how the lesson is going to be delivered for your students. Happy planning!